Hub 01 terminal online. New data.
Report. Non-infected entities detected.
Audio sample recorded.
Pedro awoke to the sound of birds chirping, the rumbling engines of cars driving by his second-floor apartment window. Another regular day, but something felt off. His stomach churned and his head ached. He needed to get food and water. Without a thought between, his shoes were already on his feet. He unlatched and opened wide his front door. A thick fog lay upon the street, like the atmosphere had descended to lay down upon the neighborhood. He shivered, his hands feeling the cold shoulders of his tank top as the damp air sapped any warmth he had left. He stumbled forward, his foot slipping off the doorstep, falling unexpectedly down to a soft and sliding mystery. Something sharp dug into his ankle. He looked down to see a grotesque image. His foot had landed deep into a dead man's rotting ribcage. The pained face was familiar to him, its eyes wide and teeth black. The exposed bone of the broken ribs were like teeth on a bear trap. The ruined torso moved up and down as the corpse attempted to breathe. As he pulled his foot back, bringing with it sticky organs, he reached back to brace himself on his front door, his hands making no contact, and fell backwards onto the soft ground. Pedro was in a gigantic pit, filled with a base layer of dead bodies. More were being shoveled in, like coals to a furnace, by yellow excavators. There was no visible bottom to the pit, just various strata of bodies. None were yet dead, all writhed in agony, those at the surface with the most liberty to move. The body before him, with a lungless voice and crazed eyes, pled for an ambulance. Pedro looked around, but could find only the man's dismembered leg. He began to club the man to death, the broken, rotted body reduced to a mess of bloody pudding. Pedro awoke, his blanket soaked with chilling sweat. A loud noise nearby, rhythmic and harsh like claws beating at a door. It was a mechanical sound, electrical like a car backing up. A fire alarm? No, his watch alarm. It was still deep night, no later than 4 a.m. Last night he had set an alarm for 6 hours of sleep. He wondered how much further his nightmare might have progressed if he'd stayed unconscious as the alarm blared on. He hadn't thought whether it could lure the undead up to his apartment. Pedro had a habit of sleeping through noise. From his strange dream, he believed it could have been blaring for minutes. He raised himself from the bed. There was enough dim light to move around the places lit by the hazy ochre sky. He could get something done before the dawn exposed him to the full light of day, where the undead fiends would notice him. He thought of the bike he'd seen days before, with its busted pedals. The bike rested on the next street over, though last he saw there were 4 zombies nearby it. With no pedals, he couldn't ride it away, but everything else on it worked. He could walk it back to safety, avoiding the zombies' gaze. Then he could simply fix the pedals and, as the day's sun rose, ride in search of gasoline. He left the apartment building. For a brief moment, the hazy clouds parted, casting early morning light across the neighborhood. The light made contrast to swaying silhouettes in the street ahead. The zombies were still here, and so was the bike. Carefully, he crept forwards to survey the whole scene. A strong zombie and another were beside the bike, preventing him from easily taking it. He needed to lure one or more away. A meandering silhouette slowly moved towards his own vague form as he backed up. He spotted a drain pipe at a nearby house and went to it as the form began to pick up its speed. He held firmly onto the pipe and walked up by bracing his feet on the metal brackets which held the precarious tube to the house. This house had 2 livable floors, and he climbed up beside a window. He smashed it in with his makeshift sap, the sound of broken glass cutting through the soundless night. He suddenly realized the danger of entering this unexplored house as part of his backup plan. Turning his flashlight on, he cautiously headed into the hall and quickly descended the stairs after turning his light back off. Pedro headed straight for a window and crept back out into the night. The one which had pursued him still rattled around where it had entered. He went back to the bike. The only other zombie was probably far enough away. He stepped up to it, then seized the bike by the handles, standing it up on its working tires. It was a clean getaway. He managed to bring the bike into his apartment's lower hallway unseen. This would soon be Pedro's first working vehicle. Once the pedals were fixed, he could use it to leisurely lure the zombies across the pits, or even scout for gasoline. He began to gather mechanical materials and bring them downstairs to what had become a working garage. There was still an hour and a half before the light would rise. He dragged an oven into the apartment's bottom floor hallway and lit a wood fire inside. With the light of the flames, he could begin his work straight away. The pedals were completely busted. There was no fixing or touching them up. He would need to replace them entirely with a different set. Worse, there was no way Pedro could fashion his own. He wasn't a blacksmith at all. He wandered around the empty streets of his block, looking for a second bike that he knew didn't exist. He considered that an exercise bike could also have the pedals he needed, but he hadn't seen one of those anywhere. Damn. He was so close to a working vehicle, but this was a stumbling block. The bike was entirely useless without a set of pedals. This wasn't an easy fix. He'd need to find a second bike and split the parts between the two. But there were other options for a working vehicle. The one that was nearest to starting was a superbike. In a garage north of his apartment, where he had found the motorcycle helmet. He looked the motorcycle over. Although his memories had been hazy ever since the Cataclysm began, he could remember having skill as a hobby mechanic. He could tell the bike had a faulty starter motor and a broken fuel filter. Not difficult fixes and entirely within his capability. The faulty starter was the main issue. Can't get going without one of those. He could fix the starter with a small electric motor. Pedro checked his stock of parts in the apartment. He didn't have a motor on his shelves, but he figured that a fridge might have one. He dragged the fridge out of the apartment where he'd taken the oven from and disassembled it. The engine in this one seemed too small for the superbike. It was clearly not enough to get the bike's fairly massive engine running. The replacement starter motor didn't need to be incredible. It just had to be strong enough to start the combustion engine moving. He could get the right size of motor from something like a washing machine. There was a washing machine in the house north of here, which he knew was safe. As he opened the washing machine up, Pedro cracked a grin and retrieved a small electric motor. This was exactly what he needed now to move forwards with the superbike. He brought the small engine over and attached it to fix the fault. With that fixed, the only visible problem was that the engine also had an expired fuel filter, which would make it likely to backfire. This could hurt the engine and create a lot of noise at an uncontrollable moment. Pedro had an idea how to make a makeshift fuel filter. He'd just need paper, a can, and duct tape. The duct tape he had on a shelf, and he tore up a satire novel for paper. Any excuse to drink a beer was good enough for Pedro, and he emptied out an aluminum can. He ruffled the paper and fitted into the can, then taped it back up. This would be better than nothing and would at least make the engine reliable. Now the last problem was to fill the tank with fuel, so that he would have plenty enough for whatever scouting he wanted to get done today. Pedro picked up a rubber hose from the fridge he'd taken apart, and emptied out 2-gallon jugs which had been storing ammonia. With these he could siphon fuel. He headed out to find one of the broken vehicles that was a possibility for gasoline. The morning sun was now beginning to rise, perfect timing for these last stages of preparation. Luckily, a jeep just south of his apartment was loaded with gasoline. He filled the superbike up to about 80% of its capacity. He was anxious to get going, and Pedro figured that this would be enough gas to drive a long ways. He started up the superbike. It jolted back to life like his own Frankenstein monster. It purred boldly as Pedro rode it out of the garage and back into his apartment's lower hall. He removed a bike basket from the pedal-less bike and attached the basket onto the superbike. If he came across any supplies on this first trip, he could load them in there. Pedro loaded up on his duffel bags and backpacks. He wasn't sure what this trip would lead to, but he wanted to be ready for anything. He took medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, antibiotics, plus food and water. He felt hopeful as he straddled the superbike, and for the first time, drove out of the apartment building where he'd spent the hellish past 3 days. He didn't have a clue how far he would travel today. He could find anything out there. His highest hope was for other survivors. To find a living soul would let him know that he wasn't alone. Pedro headed east towards a garage he'd spotted days before. He had wondered through sleepless nights about this garage. What would he find inside? The road east of town headed straight into a military roadblock with a live-firing riot control platform. He had been moving fast. It took a quick reaction to prevent heading face first into the firing cannon. He swerved off the road and headed south, hoping that in this early morning light, the automated gun wouldn't have seen him. It was firing at approaching zombies. As he carried on, what he saw made him nearly lose control. A giant pit, choked with corpses, lay before him. Many still moving, their bodies drained, falling over the shivering mass as they tried to escape the gravity of their putrid fate. Pedro turned and weaved between the pit and the roadblock, a rock and a hard place. He was nearing the garage, and he tried to steady his nerves so that he wouldn't fall off the bike. He was moving fast, and because of that, the horrors he observed hit him at a rapider pace than he could truly handle. Just ahead, he spotted 3 crates in an open field. He hoped that there might be something left behind by whoever had been operating the killing pit. He cracked open one of the crates, and inside he found 2 automatic rifles. The first was an FN Scar-L, a common military assault rifle, and an M2010 ESR, another rifle. Just minutes, and his bike's basket was already filled. The other crates had some light military gear, including knee pads, which he put on. The garage was just ahead. Although he didn't have much more space, he wanted to scout it out before returning home. He hoped that there would either be some vehicle or parts here, left behind in the chaos that had happened. But as he drew nearer, he realized that it was a log-hewn, run-down place. Pedro felt uneasy, and his fears were validated as he noticed 3 upright figures in the distance. These were not zombies. They were living, breathing people just like Pedro. Living proof that he was not alone, that others too had survived whatever hellish calamity had occurred. He hoped that they were fellow survivors and not just a desperate mirage. But his concern couldn't be avoided. Each detail which he observed about the building's surroundings and its inhabitants set him to unease. He kept up speed and followed the highway which curved around the structure. He didn't want the people here to consider him a threat, but he was also not about to stop moving so that they could easily aim at him. He hoped that he was no longer alone, but still he knew that he had to be ready for the worst. His superbike could provoke a robbery, same as the guns rattling in his rear basket. On the opposite side of the road, he nearly rubbernecked as he noticed the giant spider webs which netted the forest opposite to the garage. This was a strange place to call home. He spotted an additional 2 figures, making for 5 residents of this place. They moved quickly, shouting to one another. This affirmed his fear that he was treading too close to them. As he rounded the corner of the garage, he realized that this highway was a dead end. Suddenly, one of the people shouted out for him to halt. Pedro noticed they held a pistol loosely at the side. He had to leave immediately. He couldn't tell how many others were here and who could be aiming a fatal shot. He spanned the bike around, wincing for the sound of a gunshot and the stinging pain of what would kill him. As he turned, he accelerated, barely avoiding the webbed trees as he tried to leave as quickly as he could. He felt and heard nothing. Pedro escaped from the log garage and the people within. He carried on south through a field, passing the giant corpse pit and heading straight away from the place. The field met up to a road which must be the real highway, leaving the city heading east. As the highway threaded into a forest, Pedro noticed a group of zombies. One seemed especially unnerving. Its hands shook at painfully rapid speed as its blue-mottled skin and unnatural eyes seared into his retina. The shine of an aluminum bat broke Pedro free from his horrified, enraptured gaze. The bat was laying just beyond a corpse. He wondered whether the body on the ground had been recently slain. Most of the undead had been risen already for days. He wanted that aluminum bat. He braced himself for what he would attempt, to scoop up the bat as he passed by at speed. As he reached at the body, he noticed that it had been perforated by gunshot wounds. His suspicions turned to the people at the log garage. The undead group oddly headed into the forest, passing him right by. He felt a bizarre sense of dislocation. He looked down at the body on the road. It had perhaps been another lone survivor like he was. But they had been shot dead. Their survival ended there. The new aluminum bat was worth more to him now than any gun. He was best at bashing weapons, and it never ran out of ammo. It was great to once again have a powerful melee weapon. As he headed down the winding forest highway, he thought back to the people at that log garage. It was unnervingly close to where he slept. He feared that he could never truly be safe in his apartment, knowing they were there, and them knowing he was armed. The distance could be closed in minutes, catching him unaware while he slept. Now that he had met them, there was no going back to a restful slumber in the apartment building. He had a sickening realization that he had just lost his home. He cut back west, back towards his apartment. His bike basket was already full with found supplies, and he decided that he'd best visit his home sooner rather than give the strangers time to organize. He needed to add more storage space to his bike. As he went west, he headed towards a mass of zombies, luring it up and towards his pit, and incidentally also his home. He took the time to trawl the undead towards his pit. The fastest and most agile zombies came to the head of the pack. A zombie hunter running on all four legs kept up with an inhuman pace as the others fell behind. 3 running zombies kept behind him as their speed separated them from the slower herd. Pedro kicked up the accelerator and deftly navigated beside the edge of his pits. He turned sharply before hitting the van. He watched with a sinking feeling as a hunter zombie leapt right over the pits. This one wouldn't be so easy to kill. He twisted the accelerator and span away towards the familiar intersection in front of his apartment building. He reached back into the basket and brought out the Scar-L rifle, stepping close enough to the zombie hunter that it came running. He trained his aim on the coming monster, firing a shot that caught it in the torso. A trail of blood sprayed out behind it, but it kept running. He fired another aimed shot. The hunter was almost dead. He quickly retrieved his aluminum bat from the basket, dropping his rifle. As he took a swing, the monster collapsed from blood loss. He mashed it with the aluminum bat until it was truly dead. Then he carried on. These other zombies were not nearly as agile as the hunter. He lured the zombies over the pits, circling like a whirlwind as the slow zombies were drawn tighter and tighter together, scrambling over the pits and to their deaths. With each batch, Pedro stopped the motorcycle to finish the twitching corpses. Then it was another batch of zombies. When the ones that had pursued him were finally dead, he rode the motorcycle into the apartment hallway. It was time to add more cargo storage. He created a stow board at the back of the bike. He wouldn't be able to see over this storage box, but it held approximately 3 times as much as a bike basket. He installed the bike basket instead on the handlebars. In total, he had 4 times as much cargo space as before. He dropped off the empty rifle and kept the Scar-L with its 17 rounds. There was no knowing what he might come up against as he kept on scouting. It was only 7:12 a.m., and the bike still had roughly 70% of its fuel left. Pedro hesitated to stay for long. He was intensely paranoid of the group of people he'd seen, especially after finding the dead survivor. More scouting would enable him to find other options quickly. Pedro set off again, heading east out of the city. He passed by the mass grave and went beyond the forest road. Passing some cars, he came upon a light industrial center with an empty parking lot that seemed to have a set of garages and shelves with advanced tools. He saw an electric chainsaw resting on one side. The light industrial center could be useful. He just had to draw the zombies away and he could take what he needed from within. Pedro lured the zombies towards the wide road at the north, then took a pass through the industrial center. It looked like it was now clear. He opened a garage door and headed in. A crawling zombie grabbed his leg and he beat it down. He grabbed an electric chainsaw. He could use this as a weapon or tool or take it apart for mechanical scrap. He looted the other side of the industrial park, finding books on machining and electronics. These books would be perfect for learning how to use the machining stations here, and likely had recipes for various industrial crafts. Pedro drove off, heading to the east, coming up on a lumber mill. As he came up on the mill, he saw something peculiar in the bushes. A zombie appeared to be fighting with a squat, red creature. So long as they didn't interfere with him, he could carry on. Pedro noticed a bicycle off to the side. It had a working pedal, which after he cleared this area he could retrieve. That bike pedal still mattered to Pedro, despite him having the superbike. He still didn't know whether he could find enough fuel as he needed. He may have to fall back to a manually powered bike. Ahead, he spotted 2 guns laying on the ground. This was becoming an excellent find. There was one zombie soldier up ahead. Pedro approached with the intention of leading it away. But as he passed a security van, from the corner of his motorbike helmet's vision, he noticed the strangest being he'd seen yet. An alien creature emerged from the rear hatch of the van, supine tendrils quivering excitedly as it heard and saw him on his humming bike. He span around in a tight U-turn, hoping to make some distance from this unpredictable creature. As it ran beside him, mockingly and terrifyingly close, he cranked the accelerator. It matched his speed, as if it considered this encounter to be a curious game. The thing raced ahead of the bike as Pedro cranked the accelerator further. The bike won out for speed, and the alien became lodged beneath the heavy wheel. The bike's tires squealed, and the alien let out an odd, squealing cry. Pedro swung the front tire to the side, and the alien launched out from beneath, its body crashing into the side of the security van. The creature's lower shell was cracked in several places, and it looked like it could no longer walk. The zombie soldier then approached the mangled alien. Pedro had a dark realization of how this encounter would now end. He made some distance, then stopped the bike and took out his SCAR-L rifle. He removed his helmet, his gloves, and his goggles as the alien weakly delayed the zombie soldier's inevitable advance. The alien let out a quivering cry that made Pedro feel ashamed for what he'd done. He watched as the cries became faint, and the zombie soldier broke open the alien's gurgling carapace. The zombie burrowed its head inside the shelled cavity, and only when it emerged, a blue organ pulsating in its blackened teeth, did Pedro fire a slew of rounds into the zombie soldier's back. He fired 3 shots into it, and then retrieved his aluminum bat from his motorcycle. The zombie soldier died. Perhaps the person who this soldier had once been would have been interested to know that they had killed an intergalactic invader. Pedro removed the pedals from the bicycle, his mind simultaneously shocked and blank. Shouldn't he have more of a reaction to having seen and killed an alien species? His mind was reeling from the realization that nearly anything could come wandering in from the woods, even monsters which were entirely beyond his imagination. An endless and incomprehensible wrongness was set upon his world, as if zombies weren't enough. There were 2 M4A1 rifles here, each with a few rounds left. He stored them in his bike and then checked inside the security van. On the floor was a case containing 2 sparkling diamonds. He had to assume they were the real thing, given that this was a high-security van. He pocketed them. Maybe they would mean something to somebody. He rode his motorcycle into the lumber mill and opened the garage door. Inside, he realized that he was looking at all the materials he would ever need to make anything out of wood. This was enough to make an extensive raft or even a fortress. There was a car here with some gasoline left in the tank. It started up just fine. Pedro was satisfied with his superbike for now, but if he needed to move any batches of wood, this car could do the trick. Then he noticed beyond it was a flatbed truck, possibly in working condition. He climbed in and turned it on. The flatbed truck was working. With this, he could truly move this wood, as well as anything from his apartment, anywhere he wanted. His first thought was to move the wood up the river. There, he would be able to put together a boat and travel by water. If there were no nearby boats, he could adapt a car into a boat by stripping out the metal frame and replacing it with wood. But it got better still. He found a gasoline pump around back. The gauge informed him it had 243 liters of fuel there. An incredible amount of fuel to find. Considering his superbike could take a maximum of 10 liters, this pump had enough to fuel his motorbike 24 times over. He checked the flatbed truck to compare, which could carry 120 liters of gas. He figured that he could fuel the flatbed truck 2 times over. The lumber mill changed everything. Having access to a huge supply of gas and wood meant that Pedro could essentially move and build anywhere he wanted. He could load anything and everything into the truck's bed and carry a huge stock with him. His mind felt fried with all that had happened to him today. This scouting trip had led to finding a stockpile of fuel and a working flatbed truck. He had enough wood planks, sheets, and nails to do anything he ever wanted. But also, he had discovered a hostile survivor group. He couldn't allow for the possibility that they would ambush him while he slept. He knew that he could no longer stay at the apartment. And that is enough for the 6th episode. I think that this season is going to end up being much longer than the first one. I mean, we're basically only at the 4th day. Days tend to move faster if I can really fortify a position, but I think that Pedro may need to find a new place to live now, so maybe a little while. I'm really excited by the possibilities for this wood supply stockpile as well as the flatbed truck and all the fuel. I love the randomness of Cataclysm. You never know what to expect when you go scouting. I was very lucky to find this. I have to keep in mind my challenge, which is to survive a full 30 days. I'm already seeing some zombies begin mutating and evolving with my maximum speed evolution settings. Before long, if Pedro doesn't settle down, he'll be forced to settle by the growing monsters. I'm not sure whether NPCs are coded to actually attack the player from different locations, but I don't want to find out by having Pedro slain in the middle of the night. I enforce roleplay limits on myself, and I think it's very reasonable that finding a hostile survivor group within minutes of my shelter would force me to leave. After all, I have to sleep for 8 hours, during which they could, within a span of minutes, find and kill me. I'm so emotionally invested into Pedro's survival now. I have high hopes for him. I think we'll be able to go far over his month. With all that said, take care, be well, and I look forward to the next episode of Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day.